Buying a flat is the biggest scam. So should you buy a house or a flat? This is probably one of the most important questions you're going to have to ask yourself. One of them can make you money and the other one can lose you money. So let's discuss the differences. First thing we need to discuss is whether you're going to buy a freehold or a leasehold property. One of them will give you a lot of headache, but it's important that you understand the ins and outs in order to protect your investment, but more importantly, protect your home. So what is a freehold? A freehold effectively means you own the land in which the structure, the house, is built on. Technically, the King Charles, owns all the land in the country. But in the context of home ownership, a freehold means you own the land in which your property sits on. That gives you a lot of freedom in comparison to what we call the leasehold, which means you are effectively borrowing the usage of that property for a period of time, because the freeholder, which is the owner of the land, owns the building, the land, and the decision making with regards to your flat. So freehold tends to give you a lot more freedom, a lot more liberty, and a lot more choices, whereas a leasehold property tends to have a number of restrictions. And those restrictions make sense because you are effectively borrowing the usage of that property for a period of time. To go deeper and to give you a better understanding, when you buy a leasehold property, you were given or granted permission under your lease to utilize that property for a period of time. And that can be 99 years, 199 years, or what we call a virtual freehold, which is 999 years. And when that lease period reverts to zero, it means the owner of the land, the freeholder, can get ownership of that property. So in simple terms, a leasehold is a glorified control of that property for a specific period of time or a specified period of time. Let's talk about leaseholds really quickly. You can get a standard leasehold property. You can also have a share of a freehold. A share of a freehold is where there are multiple people who have some level of control over the governance and the management of that property. So for example, if there are 5 people in the building, you could all have 20% share of that freehold, which means you're all equal decision makers with regards to how that property is run and maintained. And then there's one that a lot of people don't know about. It's freehold flats. You might typically hear people saying that all flats are leasehold, but that's not true. There are some freehold flats. Now those bring an additional issue. Many banks don't like freehold flats because banks prefer flat owners to have a freeholder, because the freeholder effectively governs your behavior and the management of that flat. Whereas with a freehold flat, you are effectively governing yourself. So it's a self-governance, and banks don't like that because they prefer you to have someone that's established, someone that knows what they're doing, and somebody that has control over the asset to maintain and look after the asset. But those are the 3 that you need to consider when you are buying a flat. One of the reasons people prefer freehold properties is because there aren't many restrictions on a freehold property. Taking into consideration that your freehold property is not in a conservation area, you can typically make amendments, alterations, or do a loft conversion or a rear extension in your property, because you own the land in which your property sits on. But a leasehold doesn't have the same freedom. A leasehold has multiple restrictions. For example, in your lease, which is the documents and the contracts that govern your relationship with the freeholder, it stipulates what you can do and what you cannot do. And in many leases, some of these stipulations are as crazy as you cannot change your kitchen unless you get permission from the freeholder. You cannot erect a partition wall unless you get permission from the freeholder. And this is really important because when you buy the property, you are effectively agreeing to the terms of that lease. And this is why it's important to read the lease to understand what you can do and what you cannot do. So let's talk about some of the costs associated with freehold properties and leasehold properties. Now, naturally and realistically, you don't have to get to the end of this video to understand my position that a freehold wins this debate. Some of the costs associated with buying a freehold property are usually significantly lower than the cost associated with a leasehold property. The simple reason is when you own the property as a freehold, if you've got a leak in your property, you can hire any builder or any plumber to come and fix the leak. If you wanted to do some alterations to your kitchen or to your bathroom, you can hire anyone to come and do that work. If anything in your property needs updating or upgrading, you can hire anyone and negotiate the prices. Whereas with a leaseholder, because you are borrowing the usage of that property for a specified period, you don't have the same liberty as a freeholder to hire a builder or contractor to come and do work, especially in the communal areas in your property. And this leads on to a specific charge called a service charge. So you have to be fully aware of how much your service charge is going to be. And when you are buying a flat, your solicitor will tell you as part of the lease conditions how much your service charge will be every single year. Your service charge is payments that you make to the freeholder. For some of my properties, I make the payments on a monthly basis. For some of my properties, I pay them every 6 months. And for some of my properties, I pay them every single year. It really depends on what it says in the lease. In comparison to a freeholder, there are no monthly upkeeps or monthly service charges that you have to pay. Now, ground rent is another cost. Ground rent is something you should definitely speak to your solicitor about in more detail. Ground rent are also payments that you make to the freeholder, whereas in comparison to buying a freehold, there are no ground rent costs. So it's important to speak to your solicitor when you are buying a flat and discuss in detail about something called a ground rent, because some ground rents, and this will be stipulated in your lease, can be reviewed every 15, 20 or 25 years. And that review means the freeholder can increase your ground rent. Now, once the ground rent gets to a certain level, it sometimes means that your property can no longer be mortgageable, or you have less options when it comes down to remortgaging the property, because there are less lenders who are willing to lend on a property that has a high ground rent with also an upcoming review. Very important, because if the upcoming review suggests in the lease that your freeholder can double or charge any amount that they want as an increase in your ground rent, your mortgage company could be a little bit cautious, because the question is, can you afford to pay your service charge? Can you afford to pay the mortgage? Can you afford to pay the maintenance? And can you afford to pay the ground rent? The reason the ground rent is really important is if you fail to make your ground rent payments, and this could be because the price has gone up, your freeholder can serve you a section 146 notice, which is a forfeiture of your lease, which means they can take the property from you because you haven't paid your ground rent. So this is really, really important. Now, bear in mind that if you buy a freehold property, no one can come and take your property from you because you haven't made any specific payments, because there are no specific payments to be made. When you are considering buying a flat, you've got to take into consideration the lease length. Remember what I said earlier, if you're buying a leasehold property, which is a flat. By the way, you can get some leasehold houses, so it's important to make that distinction. But for the purpose of this video, when we're talking about leasehold properties, we're going to be referring to flats. When you are buying a flat or a leasehold property, you are usually given a specific time period in which you have control and usage of that flat. Now, as I mentioned, it could be 99 years, it could be 199 years, and it could be 999 years. When a property lease falls below 80 years, you often get less lenders willing to lend on those properties, because the closer that lease falls to zero, because remember, at zero, the owner of the land, the freeholder, can get access to owning that property. So the closer that lease gets to zero, banks start to get a bit more cautious and a bit more wary with regards to giving you a mortgage on that property. So have that in the back of your mind. However, that shouldn't scare you, because you are allowed to ask for an increase in your lease. So if your property gets to around 80 years, you are allowed to request to renew the lease to a increased amount. That typically has a cost associated with that. Be very cautious when you are buying a property that the lease is getting closer to 80 years. Now, again, a good solicitor will let you know when you are buying the property, and it will give you some insight and some indication on how much it will cost to renew the lease and increase the lease, or whether or not you should actually buy the property. If you buy a freehold property and you want to make alterations to it, such as create a new bedroom, convert it from a 2-bed into a 3-bed, maybe go up into the loft, or maybe do a rear extension, you don't have to ask anyone. But in a leasehold property, because remember, the freeholder owns the building and the land in which the property is situated on, therefore giving you access to utilizing that property for a 99-year period or a 199-year period, you have to get permission, specific written permission from the freeholder to make alterations. If you are to make alterations without the permission, your freeholder can also serve you with a section 146 notice, which is to forfeit the lease because you have broken the terms of the lease. So there are very, very strict restrictions when buying a flat. This is really key, because if you don't know these things, one small mistake could cause you to lose your property. Now, I know a lot of people don't talk about this. A lot of people buy a flat and they don't fully understand that the lease going to zero means they lose the property, or they fail to realize that you've got to extend the lease and there's payments associated with extending the lease. And in some cases, it could be in the tens of thousands up to £50,000. The main issue with leasehold properties is you're given like a 10-page contract, which is your leasehold. how many people realistically read it? That's what you pay a solicitor for, but you should also read it because it's a small, tiny mistakes can cause you to lose your property. Other restrictions that you have to be cautious about, and this is in many leases that most people are not aware of, and I've read lots of leases. One of the major restrictions in leasehold properties is that you are not allowed to run a business from that property. So in some cases where you might set up a nail shop or doing eyelashes or doing people's hair or running some sort of business from that premises is prohibited. But you've got to read your lease. If you are thinking about running a business from your property, some leases specify specifically that this property should not be used for business and should only be used as a family dwelling, and it could be stipulated in many different ways. Now, with the cost of living crisis and people trying to find ways to make some money to pay their bills and pay their rent and pay their mortgage, a lot of people are moving towards renting their properties on Airbnb when they go on holiday for a bit of extra cash. Many leases stipulate that you are not allowed to run Airbnb or short-term lets or serviced accommodation from those properties. So it's often these small contraventions that you might not be aware of that could cause you to trip up and could cause you to lose your property. Now, is your freeholder going to seize your property and take the property from you because of some of these mistakes? Well, it depends completely on the freeholder. So should you buy a house, a freehold property, or a flat, a leasehold property? Well, both of them have their pros and both of them have their cons, but it comes down to you understanding what's inside your lease. Hey guys, if you get some value from this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any further questions, pop them in the comment section below, and I will try my best to answer as many of them as possible for you.